It was supposed to be the proudest day of my life. The kind of day you play over and over in your head, imagining how it'll feel to finally be seen. I'd worked for years to get there. Sleepless nights, part-time jobs, late library hours with cold coffee and aching eyes. And when they called my name, when I walked across that stage, I could feel my chest rise like I was finally breathing for the first time. People clapped. Strangers smiled. I searched the crowd for just one face. My dad was there, front row, but instead of pride, he gave me that look, the one I knew too well, disappointed, dismissive. And when I reached him after the ceremony, hoping for even the smallest sign that I mattered, he scoffed. All that for a piece of paper? I needed a son to take over the business, not a daughter playing dress-up. He laughed. I didn't. I felt like the ground should have opened and swallowed me whole. My classmates saw it. My professors probably heard it. I stood there, frozen in my own skin, cheeks burning, diploma in hand, wishing I could disappear. You don't forget a moment like that. It doesn't just hurt. It brands you. That shame gets stitched into your memory, tight and permanent. And no matter how much you try to shake it, some part of you stays back on that stage, small and silent. But in that silence, something else woke up. Something fierce. I smiled, not for him, but for myself. Because deep down, I knew one day I'd make sure he saw me, really saw me. And when that day came, he'd remember every single word he said. The ride home that day was quiet. He didn't say much, just drove with the radio humming low, like even the music didn't want to speak to me. I sat in the passenger seat, still in my gown, fingers tracing the edges of my diploma case. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream. But instead, I felt hollow. Like someone had carved the joy out of me and left me holding the shell. I kept thinking, is it really so hard to say I'm proud of you? It wasn't the first time he'd cut me down, but it was the first time it left a scar I could feel. He always had this way of turning moments into lessons, harsh ones. If I aced a test, it wasn't hard enough. If I won something, it didn't matter unless it made money. His world was built on control and legacy. I was supposed to fit into that like a puzzle piece, but I never did. I was the wrong shape. And on graduation day, he made damn sure I knew it. I think some part of me still hoped he'd come around, that maybe later he'd pull me aside, say he was just nervous or bad with words, that he'd hug me and say he was proud but didn't know how to show it. But that moment never came. Instead, he went back to work the next day like nothing had happened. I was just a line on his calendar, grad ceremony 10 a.m., checked off and forgotten. That kind of hurt settles deep, like dust in an old room. You don't see it right away, but it's there, covering everything. And while everyone else moved on with summer plans and job interviews, I stayed quiet, numb. But inside, a fire had started. I didn't know how or when, but I swore to myself, one day I'd rise so high he'd have no choice but to look up and remember. I kept that day locked away, not to forget, but to fuel me. Every time I doubted myself, I'd go back to that moment, to his face, his words, the way he looked right through me, like I was invisible in my own story. It became the voice in my head, whispering I wasn't enough. And instead of running from it, I used it. Every early morning, every rejection, every tiny win. It all looped back to that stage, that shame, and the quiet promise I made. People think pain breaks you. And sometimes it does. But if you let it, it can also build something stronger. I didn't have a roadmap or a family business to fall into. What I had was drive, grit, a heart that refused to shrink even when it ached. So I started where I could, small jobs, unpaid internships, answering phones, fetching coffee. I smiled when it hurt. I learned when no one was watching. I was determined to become someone he couldn't ignore. Looking back now, I don't think he ever imagined I'd make it far without him. In his mind, my success needed to look like his, or it didn't count. But I wasn't trying to prove him wrong anymore. I was trying to prove me right, that I could be more than the girl he dismissed, that I could carve out a life so full, so undeniable, it would speak louder than any apology he'd never give. So while he stayed wrapped in his world of ledgers and tradition, I stepped into mine, one small, uncertain step at a time. And with every step forward, I got further from that stage and closer to something I could finally call mine. The real world didn't wait for me to catch my breath. Graduation was barely over when the pressure started creeping in. Rent, job hunts, bills that didn't care about dreams. I remember sending out resumes like prayers, most of them unanswered. I landed a job as a glorified assistant in a company no one's ever heard of. Windowless office, broken printer, a boss who thought my name was Hey. But I showed up, every day, early. I stayed late. I watched everything. I didn't have connections or a last name that opened doors. But what I did have was a hunger that kept me going, even when I was running on fumes. I saved every dollar I could. I read business books on the train. I watched my coworkers, how they negotiated, how they cracked under pressure, how they stayed quiet in rooms they should have spoken in. I was invisible to most of them. But that gave me power. No one sees you coming when they think you're nobody. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring out the office window at night, imagining what it would feel like to belong at the table, not just serve it. There were days I wanted to quit, weeks when everything felt like failure. But that voice in my head, the one that started on graduation day, wouldn't let me stop. "You'll never be enough," it whispered, and I whispered back, "Watch me." I carried that fire with me like armor, and little by little I started to rise. I took risks. I pitched ideas even when no one asked. I moved from assistant to junior analyst, then to project lead. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I made mistakes, big ones, but I owned every one of them. And somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to prove I was worth something and started believing it. The shift didn't happen all at once. It was in tiny, almost invisible wins, the kind no one claps for. Getting through a client call without second-guessing myself. Standing my ground in a meeting when someone talked over me. The first time someone asked for my input instead of overlooking me. I'd go home exhausted, but that kind of tired feels different when you're building something. Even if you can't see it yet, you know it's there, like the bones of a house before the walls go up. Eventually, I took a leap and went out on my own. Small consulting gigs at first, mostly helping businesses with branding and operations. It wasn't sexy, and it definitely wasn't stable, but I was learning fast. Every client brought a new puzzle, and I loved cracking them. I started to realize I didn't want to fit into someone else's system. I wanted to build my own. Something smarter. Leaner. Built on empathy and instinct, not just numbers and ego. Money was tight in the beginning. I still remember crying in the grocery store once, trying to figure out if I could afford coffee that week. But I also remember the first time I got paid more than I thought I was worth. I stared at that check for 10 minutes, afraid it was a mistake. That was the first time it hit me. Maybe I wasn't just surviving anymore. Maybe I was growing into someone my younger self would be proud of. And God, she deserved that. Meanwhile, my dad's name started coming up in conversations, not in a good way. His company was struggling, refusing to change, still clinging to the old playbook like it was the Bible. Some said he was too stubborn to see what was coming. Others said he never believed the world could move on without him. I didn't say a word. I just listened. And deep down, something in me stirred. Not joy, not revenge. Just a quiet sense that the tide was shifting. I never wanted him to fail, not really. But watching his empire crack while I was quietly building mine, it felt poetic. I didn't celebrate it, but I didn't feel sorry either. Life has a way of humbling people who think they're untouchable. And for the first time, I wasn't the one being overlooked. I was growing roots, deep ones. Clients started referring me. A small office turned into a team. I rebranded, expanded. Before I knew it, I wasn't just running a business. I was the business. I kept my name off everything public, used my middle name professionally. Part of it was strategy. Part of it was self-protection. I didn't want to be traced back to him, not yet. I wasn't ready to invite him into this version of my life, the one I'd crafted from scratch. But I followed the headlines. I saw the articles about his company losing relevance, his product line flopping, his desperate attempts to stay afloat in a world that had outgrown him. It was happening, slowly, publicly, and without mercy. I should have felt vindicated, and maybe a small part of me did. But mostly, I felt ready for the next move. I'd spent so long climbing, healing, learning how to carry my pain without letting it weigh me down. Now, I wanted more than distance. I wanted closure. The kind that doesn't come from waiting for an apology. The kind you create with your own two hands. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth to be felt, understood, remembered. So when I heard, through the grapevine, that his company was looking for a strategic partner, I stayed quiet, just watched, waited. And somewhere deep inside, I smiled. Funny, I thought. Looks like he could use someone smart and educated now. When the email came through, I knew immediately. The name of the company was the same, but the tone was different, almost desperate. They were requesting a pitch meeting with one of our subsidiaries, not knowing the woman behind the curtain. It felt surreal. All those years of hearing I was too soft, too idealistic, too emotional for business. And here I was, being courted by the very man who said those things. Except he didn't know it yet. That was the beauty of it. I kept my composure, sent it to my team. "Let's schedule something next week," I said, like it was just another name on the calendar. Inside, I felt like I was balancing on a wire. Not because I was afraid, but because I'd dreamed of this moment so many times, and now it was real. I had the upper hand, quietly, completely, and no one, not even him, could take that from me. I wasn't his daughter in this meeting. I was the decision maker. When he walked into the room, I didn't even flinch. I watched him shake hands with my team, eyes scanning the space like he owned it. He wore the same tailored suit, the same smug grin that had once made me feel small. But this time, it didn't land. He looked older now, weighed down, still trying to sell confidence like a product, but you could hear the strain beneath his words. My team listened politely. I stayed silent, watching him pitch to the company I built. He still talked like women were decoration, tossed out sweetheart and darling like punctuation, tried to dominate the room with outdated charm and empty promises. And I let him. I let him dig his own hole, word by arrogant word. It was almost fascinating, watching a man so rooted in the past trying to sell a future he didn't understand. When the meeting ended, I extended my hand with a polite smile. "Thank you for the offer," I said. "We'll be in touch." As soon as the door closed behind him, my team turned to me, curious. "He's got confidence," one of them joked. I just smiled and nodded, like it didn't sting. But inside, I was unraveling a lifetime of memories in slow motion. Every dismissive look, every eye roll. Every time he told me I was being dramatic, too sensitive, or wasting my time. And now here he was, unknowingly asking me for help, from the very place he once told me I didn't belong. I didn't tell my team who he was, not yet. It wasn't about theatrics, it was about timing. This wasn't revenge for the sake of pain, it was something bigger. I wanted him to sit in that same uncertainty I'd lived in for years, the not knowing, the not being seen. I wanted him to wonder why the deal didn't close right away, why the feedback was vague, why things felt just out of reach. He'd always been the one calling the shots. Now he was just another name in the pipeline. I started pulling the strings quietly. Research, projections, risk analysis. His company was bleeding cash. Their model was ancient, their leadership outdated. We didn't need them, but he needed us. That was the power shift, and I wasn't going to waste it. I crafted a proposal not just to acquire, but to transform. Every clause was intentional, every term a reflection of what he used to dismiss. Innovation, inclusion, long-term vision, words he'd once sneered at. Still, I felt the tug of something deeper. Not pity, but history. He was still my father, and no matter how far I'd come, a part of me still carried that first heartbreak. That girl on the stage, holding her diploma like a shield. I couldn't forget her. I wouldn't. But this wasn't her story anymore. It was mine, and I was rewriting it, on my terms, in my voice, with the same grace he'd never shown me. Days passed, then a week. Another follow-up from his team landed in my inbox, this time a little more eager. "We're excited to move forward," it said, "looking forward to meeting the CEO in person." I stared at the message for a long time. This was it, the next step, and I wasn't nervous. I was calm, sharpened. I had spent years becoming the kind of woman who could sit across from him without flinching, and now I was ready to let him see who he'd tried to forget. My assistant asked if I wanted to join the next meeting. I said yes, directly, clearly, with no hesitation. I gave her a list of names to exclude, people who might make the room too noisy, too safe for him. I wanted it stripped down, simple, just me and him, face to face, the way it always should have been. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to break. I didn't need to prove anything. I just wanted to be there when the weight of recognition hit him. He still didn't know who I was. That was the part that cut the deepest. Not the old insults, not the arrogance. The fact that I'd done everything, become everything, and he still didn't see me. It was almost laughable. But that was about to change. The mask was coming off. I wasn't hiding anymore. Not behind titles, not behind business names, not behind strategy. He was about to meet me, not the version he made small, but the woman who made it all real. So I told my team to schedule the meeting. No cameras, no distractions. Just a name on the invite and a seat at the head of the table. I would walk in last. And when I did, everything would finally land. The meeting room was quiet when I stepped in. He was already seated, flipping through a printed agenda like it held answers he hadn't studied for. His tie was loose, hands fidgeting with a pen cap. For a second, he looked small. Not the towering figure from my childhood, but just a man in a failing suit, waiting for a lifeline. He didn't look up right away, not until I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Then his eyes met mine. It took him a second. You could see it. That flicker of confusion, followed by disbelief. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Tilted his head like maybe the lighting was wrong, like maybe memory was playing tricks. "You?" he said. That one word, thick with years of absence. I nodded, calm, measured. I didn't need a dramatic entrance. Just being there, composed, in control, was enough to shake the air. He blinked like he was seeing a ghost, but I was more real than ever. He tried to recover, gave a half laugh, the kind you use when you're cornered but want to pretend you're not. "Look at you," he said. "Didn't expect this. You've done well for yourself." His tone wavered between condescension and surprise, like he couldn't decide which mask to wear. I didn't smile, didn't soften. I let the silence stretch, let him feel how far the distance had grown between us. I wasn't that girl with the diploma anymore, and I wasn't there to be small. "I remember everything you said that day," I told him. My voice didn't shake. Every word, every laugh, every time you made me feel like I wasn't enough." His eyes dropped. For once, he had no script. "I built this because of that moment, not in spite of it. You gave me fuel, and I turned it into fire. You made me invisible, and I became undeniable. So thank you." I slid the file across the table. "This is our offer. Take it or don't. But no, it's on my terms now." He stared at the file like it might explode. His hands didn't move. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Just a slow exhale, like he was finally realizing where he was, who he was sitting across from. "You don't understand," he said finally. "It was different back then. I didn't mean it like that." The excuses came gently, almost rehearsed, like maybe he'd been waiting for this moment too, but not like this, not with the power flipped so cleanly. "You meant it," I said, "not with anger, with clarity. You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew how to belittle, how to minimize, how to look through me like I didn't matter." He shifted in his seat, like the weight of my words had suddenly changed the gravity in the room. "You don't get to rewrite it now. You don't get to shrug it off as a different time. It was different, and I lived every second of it." He tried to smile again, softer this time. "You were always strong," he said, reaching for some version of redemption. "I guess I just wanted to push you harder. Make you tougher." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, keeping my voice steady. "You didn't make me stronger. You made me bleed in silence, and I turned that silence into something you'd never understand, because you never had to fight for your own worth. You assumed you had it from the start." He looked away then, really looked away. No performance left in him, just a man confronted by his own reflection, and not liking what stared back. I watched him sit with it, let the discomfort hang. It wasn't revenge, it was truth. And truth, when it lands, doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs to be undeniable. So I waited, because this wasn't the end. It was the part where he had to decide what kind of man he'd be in the final act. He finally reached for the file, hands slower now, measured. He flipped through the pages without speaking, his eyes scanning the numbers, the terms, the weight of what was being offered. It was a full buyout, clean, fair, more generous than he deserved, but it came with one undeniable fact: he wasn't calling the shots anymore. I was, and the only thing left for him to do was choose how he wanted to be remembered in this moment, stubborn or smart. "I thought I was building a legacy," he said quietly, "something that would outlive me." I watched him but didn't interrupt. "I thought it would be my name, my business, a son to take it on." His voice cracked, just barely. "I never imagined it would be you." And that right there, that was the wound. Not that I succeeded, but that I did it without becoming what he had planned. I wasn't a branch of his tree. I'd planted an entirely different forest. I leaned back, letting the weight of the room settle around us. "You taught me how not to treat people," I said, "how not to lead, how not to shrink others to feel bigger. And I carried those lessons with me, every day, into every decision. And I took them all the way to the top." I paused, letting him hear it, letting him feel it. "This isn't about revenge, it's about finally being seen, not as your daughter, but as the woman you didn't believe I could become." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. The kind of nod that comes when someone finally realizes the past doesn't bend to their will, when they stop trying to rewrite it and start facing it. He reached for the pen. No theatrics, no final speech. Just a quiet surrender, and the sound of ink on paper, a signature that closed a chapter in his story and opened the final one in mine. The buyout went through within the month. No headlines, no fireworks, just the sound of systems shifting, titles changing, and a legacy quietly folding into mine. I kept things discreet, not because I was hiding, but because true power doesn't need an audience. I visited the office he used to run, now a shell of what it once was. The furniture hadn't changed, but the energy had. Where there used to be fear and control, I was planting something different, something human. I didn't gut the place. I rebuilt it. I brought in new blood, hungry, curious, often overlooked. Young women with bold ideas, first-generation grads, sharp thinkers who reminded me of a younger me. They didn't just need a job. They needed someone to see them, to believe in them. And I gave them that. I gave them everything I never got. Not because I was trying to fix the past, but because I finally could shape the future, one hire at a time. In the main lobby, I placed a framed photo of my graduation day, not for vanity, but for memory, for proof. There I was, in that gown, clutching my diploma, trying to smile through heartbreak. Beneath the frame, a small plaque read, "Let your critics be your fuel." I watched new employees pause at it, reading it with quiet reverence, some of them probably wondering who the girl was. I hoped they'd never know that kind of pain, but if they did, I wanted them to feel less alone. The space began to breathe again. Color returned. Laughter, too. I walked the halls some days just to feel the shift, how different it was from the way he ran it. No more barking orders or keeping people small. This was about rising together. I wasn't trying to erase what he built. I was transforming it into something that mattered. I offered him a role, not out of pity, out of purpose. Junior advisor, a title he would have laughed at once, back when his ego filled every boardroom he entered. But now? He said yes without a fight. I think he knew. There was no empire left to protect, no illusion to uphold. He came in on time, kept his head down, didn't try to take control, just listened, learned, contributed where he could, and I let him. Not to humiliate him, but to show him there was another way. I watched him sit in rooms with people he once would have dismissed, young, brilliant, underestimated minds who were reshaping everything he thought he knew. Sometimes I caught him watching them with something like awe. Sometimes shame. Once, I even saw him nod in approval at a woman pitching an idea that would have been laughed out of his old boardroom. Progress isn't loud. It's a quiet breaking down of everything that no longer serves. And I was watching it happen, one meeting at a time. He never apologized, not in words. But actions have a weight, and I was learning to read the language of regret in the way he carried himself. He stopped correcting people, stopped assuming he knew best. He stayed after meetings to clean up cups and clear whiteboards, no longer above the small things. That alone said more than any speech ever could. Sometimes justice doesn't look like punishment. It looks like perspective. And I could live with that. I passed him in the hallway once, late one evening. The office was quiet, golden with sunset. He was carrying a box of leftover materials from a session one of my managers had led. I nodded at him, and for the first time, he looked at me without a flicker of pride or shame, just recognition. That was all I ever wanted. Not dominance, not submission, just the truth, standing on level ground. Some days I still walk past the lobby and glance at that photo. Not for validation, but for remembrance. To honor the girl I used to be, the one who stood on that stage hoping for love and got silence instead. She didn't disappear. She became the blueprint. Everything I built, every decision I made, carried a piece of her courage. And I hope, in some small way, others walking through these doors feel that courage too. That they know you can start from pain and still build something beautiful. I didn't need to ruin him. I didn't need to tear down everything he created. I just needed to rewrite the ending. In my voice, with my values. That was the real triumph. Not the money, not the title, but the quiet dignity of choosing growth over revenge, legacy over ego. The story didn't end with his fall. It began with my rise, and I wanted others to see that. Women, outsiders, the underestimated, the ones who've been told again and again that they don't belong. Now he works under the name of a company I built. He wears a badge with my logo on it, and while I don't watch him every day, I know he sees it, the way the office hums with possibility, the way people are seen, heard, valued. He sees the culture he never created, living and breathing all around him. That's his education. Not the one he gave, the one he's finally receiving. The last time I saw him cleaning up after a board meeting, he paused beside the framed photo. I didn't say a word. He didn't either. But in that moment, I think we both understood. I didn't destroy him. I educated him, the hard way.